A normal day can suddenly turn into a nightmare. From a grizzly killing 7 in minutes to a Kodiak bear tearing through a stormy camp. From fishermen fighting a polar bear to joggers attacked on a forest trail. From climbers ambushed in the mountains to a cafe destroyed by a hungry grizzly. No one was safe. In this video, we'll explore 6 chilling true stories of bear attacks on humans, revealing the terrifying moments when nature's power strikes without warning. August 27, 2025, dawned over the Kuril Islands with a sharp wind sweeping across the dark sea. The volcanic chain between Russia and Japan was known for its forbidding cliffs, icy waters, and wild predators. That morning, a group of 9 travelers gathered at a narrow dock, eager to explore one of the most remote coastlines on Earth. Their guide, Pavel Morozov, had grown up in Kamchatka and understood the dangers of the land better than most. For years, he had worked as a leader of wilderness expeditions, often taking small groups to witness the rare landscapes and marine life of the region. Pavel's reputation was built on discipline and caution, but even his experience could not prepare him for what would unfold that day. Among the travelers was Anna Fischer, a teacher from Munich with a deep love for nature. She had dreamed of visiting places untouched by cities or roads, saving for years until she could finally afford this journey. Another member of the group, David Miller, was a retired engineer from Ontario. After decades of long hours, he now traveled widely, seeking landscapes far removed from the busy world he once knew. Each traveler carried a personal history and individual reasons for being there, but all shared a common spirit of adventure that had brought them to this distant corner of the Pacific. Their small motorized craft carried them out over rolling waves, leaving the safety of the harbor behind. The first hours passed peacefully. Seabirds circled overhead while mist clung to the cliffs rising in the distance. The travelers gazed at jagged islands scattered across the horizon, marveling at the wild and unspoiled terrain. The boat's motor hummed steadily as it approached a narrow cove cut deep into the shoreline. Then, in an instant, tranquility gave way to chaos. From the jagged rocks, a massive grizzly surged forward. Its bulk crashed through the surf, water exploding around it as the animal charged with shocking speed. Before anyone could react, the predator slammed into the side of the boat with devastating force. The impact sent passengers tumbling against railings, while others were hurled overboard into the freezing waves. Panic broke across the deck as screams mingled with the roar of the sea. 3 travelers were struck down immediately. The bear's claws tore through coats and skin, its power leaving no chance for resistance. Belongings scattered across the planks as blood spread across the deck. In the water, 2 who had been thrown overboard flailed helplessly, dragged by violent currents until their heads slipped beneath the surface. Their cries vanished into the endless roar of waves. On the vessel, the attack continued with unrelenting violence. 2 more passengers were crushed beneath shattered seats and twisted gear. The bear's strike smashed wood and bone alike, its rage destroying everything within reach. Each second carried the weight of horror, the vessel groaning under the strain. At the far end of the boat, Pavel and a single survivor clung to warped railings, drenched and battered. They pressed themselves against the stern while the bear circled. It growled deeply, its presence heavy and suffocating. The moments stretched, each heartbeat a test of endurance. At last, the animal turned away. Slowly it climbed back over the wreckage and returned to the rocky cliffs, disappearing into shadow. Silence followed, broken only by the slap of waves against the broken hull. The deck was scattered with bent metal, splintered wood, and lifeless forms. Salt hung heavy in the air, mixed with the acrid scent of torn fabric and spilled blood. Pavel and the lone traveler who had survived sat motionless, paralyzed by shock. Their eyes scanned the dark surface of the sea, but nothing remained except foam drifting where their companions had disappeared. The boat drifted aimlessly. Its motor had been crushed in the attack, leaving the vessel at the mercy of the current. Around the 2 survivors lay 7 bodies, scattered across the ruined deck or pinned beneath broken gear. What had begun as a journey of discovery had become devastation in only 3 minutes. Both survivors clung to the rail, their breathing shallow, as seabirds wheeled in restless circles above. Every sound from the cliffs made them fear the predator's return. Hours passed before a patrol craft sighted the drifting wreck. Its crew approached carefully, shocked by the destruction before them. They found Pavel and the surviving traveler curled near the stern, their faces pale, clothing torn, and bodies trembling. The rescuers hauled them aboard and laid coverings over the fallen. The silence was heavy, broken only by the groan of the damaged vessel as it shifted in the tide. News of the attack spread quickly across the islands. Communities accustomed to living near wild terrain were shaken. Bears had long been a presence in forests and along the shore, but few had witnessed an assault of such ferocity and speed. Authorities dispatched teams into the valleys and rocky coves to track the animal before it could strike again. Hunters followed prints into dense undergrowth, but fog and endless ridges hindered their search. The wilderness swallowed their efforts, leaving only unease behind. Far away, families of the victims received the devastating news. In Germany, Anna Fischer's relatives gathered in sorrow, remembering the teacher who had longed to see the edge of the earth. In Canada, David Miller's children mourned the father who had believed in the healing peace of nature. Each life represented a collection of memories, and each household faced a sudden emptiness. Though separated by borders, their grief was joined by a single mourning in a remote island chain. Investigators later took testimony from Pavel and the other survivor. Their words carried the weight of trauma, recounting the moment of impact, the chaos that followed, and the speed with which lives were lost. Neither would ever forget the sudden assault or the cries that had ended so abruptly. In the weeks after, restrictions tightened along the coastline. Warnings were posted in harbors, urging vessels to avoid dangerous coves. The memory of that morning endured, serving as a stark reminder that beauty and terror can exist side by side. 7 lives had been taken, and 2 remained to carry the memory forward, forever marked by what the wild had claimed. September 14, 2024, began with a gray sky stretching over Kodiak Island, the largest island in Alaska and home to the world's biggest brown bears. 4 hikers had arrived on the rugged coast several days earlier, determined to challenge themselves against rough terrain and unpredictable weather. Among them was Michael Turner, a young biologist from Oregon who had spent years studying wildlife in the Pacific Northwest. Fascinated by the island's unique ecosystem, he had persuaded his friends to join him. With him was Sarah Blake, a nurse from Colorado who loved long treks in isolated regions. She had hiked the Rockies for years and saw this as her most ambitious adventure yet. Daniel Rhodes, a teacher from Maine with a passion for survival skills, had also come, as well as Emily Carter, an artist from Washington who painted landscapes inspired by her travels. Together they carried light tents, cooking gear, and provisions for several nights on the wind-swept coastal bluffs. By late afternoon, the weather shifted. Winds strengthened, and dark clouds stretched across the sea. Locals had long warned that storms on this island often arrived without warning, but the hikers trusted their high ground to keep them safe. As the hours passed, the gusts grew fierce, bending tall grasses around their camp. Waves slammed the cliffs below, their sound merging with the rising howl of the wind. By nightfall, heavy rain hammered their tents, sheets of water striking the fabric without pause. At midnight, the storm reached its height. Canvas snapped under pressure, poles bent and groaned, and the group huddled close inside their shelters. The roar of the weather drowned out all else, hiding the sound of heavy steps moving through the darkness. Out of the storm emerged a massive Kodiak bear, drawn by the scent of food or emboldened by the cover of the gale. With no warning, it crashed into camp. One tent collapsed instantly as claws tore through fabric, pinning 2 hikers beneath sodden canvas. Rain poured as they struggled to escape, but the predator's weight pressed them into the ground. Another tent shook violently as Emily scrambled out, gripping a flare. Sparks lit the soaked rocks, and a sudden red glow revealed the bear's enormous body, rain streaming from its shoulders. Rising high, it loomed over the camp before lunging forward. Gear scattered into the storm, cooking pots rolling into the night. A metal pan crushed in the animal's jaws with terrifying ease. For 15 agonizing minutes, the group fought to drive the creature away. They shouted into the gale, swung trekking poles, and smashed metal together, their voices nearly swallowed by the storm. Lightning split the sky, thunder booming across the cliffs, each strike casting the predator into stark silhouette. Rain blinded their eyes, yet they held their ground. The bear circled, slashing at earth and lunging again, forcing the hikers to retreat step by step across the bluff. The night had turned into a contest of endurance, a clash of predator and storm. The enormous figure shifted in the flare's fading glow, water dripping from its fur, breath steaming in the freezing air. The four hikers stood scattered across the wrecked camp, bodies trembling from cold and fear. When the bear lunged again, claws dug into the ground, scattering what little gear remained. Michael fought through the whipping gusts, striking his pole against rock to make a sharp crack. Sarah followed, smashing metal against stone, sparks flashing as lightning burst above. Daniel dragged tangled canvas from the collapsed tent, while Emily swung the last burning flare in wide arcs. They tried to appear larger, their movements frantic but determined. The animal paused, head turning from side to side, eyes blinded by rain and flashes from the storm. For endless minutes, the struggle continued. The massive body rose and fell, jaws clamping down on a bent pot, metal shrieking under the crushing force. The sound echoed across the cliffs, mixing with the crash of waves below. Two hikers finally crawled from beneath the collapsed tent, their arms gashed and backs torn, breath ragged as they stumbled to rejoin the group. Fear and pain marked their faces, but they still raised poles and struck them together, adding their noise to the storm. Then the sky itself seemed to intervene. A violent bolt of lightning split the clouds overhead, the flare of light illuminating sea, cliffs, and camp in blinding brilliance. Thunder followed instantly, shaking the bluff and rolling across the water. The bear recoiled, its head jerking back, vision lost in the glare. It swung once more through the campsite, scattering scraps of fabric and twisted poles, before slowly turning toward the cliffs. With heavy steps, it faded into shadow, swallowed by rain until only the crash of surf remained. The hikers collapsed where they stood, drained of strength. Their tents were shredded, gear scattered, food supplies gone, water poured from their clothing, their bodies bruised and cut. Two carried deep wounds across their shoulders and arms, while the others shook from cold and exhaustion. None of them slept. They clung together beneath broken canvas, enduring the storm until dawn. When daylight came, their skin was pale, lips blue, and their limbs stiff with hypothermia. By morning, the storm began to ease, but the group remained stranded on the exposed bluff. Their camp was unrecognizable, nothing but twisted frames and scraps of fabric scattered across wet ground. Hours dragged on before distant engines cut through the sound of surf. Rescue vessels approached, drawn by emergency signals the hikers had sent before the storm reached its height. Crews pulled the exhausted group aboard, wrapped them in blankets, and hurried them to warmth. News of the night spread across Alaska, told as a rare encounter where storm and predator had struck together. Locals spoke of the dangers of camping unprotected on high bluffs, of how swiftly the wild could overpower even the most prepared. The four hikers carried scars from the attack, both on their bodies and in memory. More enduring than the wounds was the knowledge of what they had faced, the unrelenting fury of nature, and the raw strength of one of the world's greatest predators. Against all odds, they had survived. March 9th, 2023, began with a pale Arctic sunrise casting long shadows across the frozen plains of northern Greenland. Near Qaanaaq, one of the most remote towns on the planet, three fishermen prepared for a long day on the ice. In this part of the world, hunting and fishing were not hobbies, but vital means of survival. Among the men was Niels Jensen, 46 years old, who had spent his entire life in the Arctic. Strong and resilient, he was accustomed to brutal cold and the long hours required to bring home food for his family. Beside him stood Anders Holm, 39, respected among locals for his skill with tools and his unyielding endurance on the ice. The youngest of the group, Erik Larsen, was less experienced but determined, eager to learn from the older fishermen and carry forward the traditions that defined life in such an unforgiving land. The morning was calm. Their sled dogs moved steadily across the frozen surface, breath rising in clouds that trailed into the sharp wind. Strapped to the sled were drills, augers, a compact heater, and other gear needed for the work ahead. Once they reached their chosen spot, the men set to drilling holes through the ice, the steady grind of tools carrying across the silent plain. The Arctic was known for its stillness, broken only by the call of seabirds or the distant crack of shifting ice. Focused on their task, the fishermen did not notice that danger watched from behind a ridge of snow. From the white rise, a polar bear emerged. Its coat blended seamlessly with the frozen expanse, nearly invisible until it stepped forward. Moving low and silent, the predator crept closer with deliberate strides. The men's backs were turned when the bear suddenly broke into a charge. In seconds, the animal closed the distance, slamming into the sled with terrifying power. Wood splintered, metal bent, and supplies spilled onto the ice. The heater toppled with a metallic clang. Niels was thrown hard onto the frozen ground, the impact forcing the air from his lungs. A claw raked across his parka, tearing through fabric and slicing into skin beneath. Blood darkened the snow as he struggled to stand. Anders reacted first, gripping an auger with both hands and swinging it before him. He shouted into the wind, trying to drive the animal back. Eric fumbled with a flare pistol and fired at the bear's chest. The flare burst against its fur, spraying sparks and smoke. The beast reared high, its roar rolling across the endless white. The predator's fury turned on the sled dogs. With a swipe of its massive paw, it sent them scattering, their lines snapping as they bolted across the plain. Their howls echoed into the distance, leaving the men alone on the ice. Shouts, growls, and the scrape of claws filled the silence of the Arctic, chaos breaking across the frozen expanse. Niels clutched his torn coat, blood seeping through the fabric, his body weak yet still forcing him upright. Anders raised the auger higher, refusing to drop it. Eric, hands trembling from cold and fear, reloaded the flare gun, desperate to keep fire between them and the advancing giant. The bear lunged again, striking into the remains of the sled. Broken wood and metal scattered across the surface. The fishermen shouted louder, slammed poles against the ice, and waved their arms in defiance. Their voices carried into the emptiness, merging with the howl of the wind. Another flare burst at the predator's feet, red fire staining the snow and forcing it back once more. Its heavy breath fogged the air as it swung its head, teeth bared, paws striking down with bone-rattling force. For long minutes, the confrontation dragged on. The predator lunged, withdrew, and lunged again, its enormous form blotting out the horizon each time. The men resisted with every ounce of strength. Anders swung the auger, Eric fired flares, and Niels, despite his wounds, added his voice to the wall of sound that pushed back against the beast. The glow of the flare lit the men's shadows, stretching across the ice, trembling with every desperate movement. Finally, the animal slowed. Firelight, noise, and resistance wore on its resolve. With a last roar, the polar bear turned, fading back into drifting snow. Its massive frame slipped behind the ridge, vanishing into white silence as if it had never been there at all. The fisherman collapsed in exhaustion. Niels sank to the ice, clutching his bleeding side, his hands trembling violently from cold and shock. Anders and Eric dragged him to the wreckage of the sled, using torn fabric to bind his wounds. The heater was shattered, supplies scattered and useless. With no dogs, no warmth, and barely any shelter, the three huddled together as Arctic night descended. Hours passed in misery. The wind cut into their skin, leaving faces numb and fingers stiff. They endured the night without fire, pressed against each other for warmth. By morning, their movements were slow, their bodies pale and unsteady. Every breath cut like shards of glass into their lungs. Yet they rose, leaning on poles, and began the long walk back to Kanak. When at last they reached safety, Niels required stitches for his injuries. All three men were treated for hypothermia, their bodies pushed to the limit by the cold. Their sled dogs had vanished into the night. Their gear was gone, but their lives had been spared. The attack became a stark reminder of how swiftly routine work could turn deadly in the Arctic. The ice was both a giver and a taker, offering life through fish and seals, but carrying the constant threat of predators and storms. On that day, the thin line between survival and loss had nearly disappeared. October 5th, 2017, began with a gray mist hanging low across a national forest in Montana. The trail cutting through the wilderness was narrow and lined with steep rocky slopes on one side and thick pine trees on the other. 5 friends had gathered early that morning for a run along a mountain trail, a path known for its sharp turns and breathtaking scenery. The group often trained together, pushing one another's limits and this outing was intended as another challenge to test their endurance. Among them was Mara Flynn, a 28-year-old physical therapist from Missoula. She had built her life around fitness and outdoor activity, often using running as a way to connect with the natural world. Elias Carr, 35, worked as a firefighter and trained hard to keep his body strong for the demands of his job. His dedication to running had prepared him for countless rescue calls throughout his career. Dorian Nash, 30 years old, was an athletic instructor who enjoyed taking on difficult trails across the state. Running was not only exercise for him, but also a way to explore new landscapes. With them were Noah Grant, 29, and Liam Parker, 27, both close friends since college, who joined for the physical challenge and camaraderie of the group. The 5 joggers set a steady pace, their shoes striking the packed dirt in rhythm. Fog drifted between the trees, muffling sound and hiding the edges of the forest. The trail curved tightly against the slope, leaving little space on either side. Their breaths rose in white clouds as they moved, unaware of what waited nearby. Just off the path, hidden by mist and branches, a massive grizzly bear was feeding on a deer that had fallen along the slope. The vibrations of feet striking earth carried through the ground, alerting the animal that something was near. The bear lifted its head, ears twitching at the sound of steady steps approaching. To the predator, the disturbance felt like a threat to its fresh meal. Within moments, it surged forward, crashing through the brush and breaking onto the trail in a burst of power. The runners barely had time to react. In the center of the group, Dorian, Elias, and Mara were pressed against the rocky wall as the beast closed the gap. Its claws swiped with crushing force, striking bodies before they could move away. The weight of the bear knocked them against the slope, and in seconds the 3 were down, the attack fatal and merciless. Ahead on the path, Noah and Liam saw the blur of motion and leapt toward a shallow ravine. They tumbled over rocks, scrambling behind large boulders as the bear turned its attention from the fallen to the scattered belongings. Backpacks ripped apart beneath the predator's paws, contents spilling across the dirt. The 2 survivors crouched low, hidden, their hearts racing as the animal circled the trail, its massive frame blotting out the dim light. The men pressed against the cold stone as the giant figure moved along the trail above. The heavy body swayed from side to side while claws raked through scattered packs. Food wrappers and clothing were shredded and tossed into the fog. The sound of teeth snapping on metal echoed as the animal bit down on a water bottle, crushing it flat. The forest around them was silent, except for the low growls that rose each time the bear pushed through the debris. Noah and Liam's bodies were bruised from the fall, their skin scraped raw by sharp edges of rock. The mist curled around them, making it hard to see more than a few steps ahead. Every movement from above felt louder. Every snarl seemed closer. They dared not climb back to the trail. For what felt like hours, they stayed still, waiting for the moment when the predator might turn away. The animal paced, circling the site where its meal had been disturbed. At times it drifted toward the slope, sniffing the air, before returning to paw through broken straps and torn fabric. When lightning streaked faintly through the distant clouds, the sudden brightness revealed the broad outline of its back. It rose on hind legs, towering high, before dropping down again with a crash that shook loose gravel from the bluff. Eventually, the great shape faded into the fog. The 2 men remained hidden, unsure if it had truly gone. Time passed slowly as night settled across the forest. Cold seeped into their bones, their damp clothes clinging to their bodies. Blood from cuts dried against their skin, and the chill left them shivering without relief. Exhaustion pressed on them, but fear kept them awake. Above them lay the sight of horror, and neither could forget the sounds that had marked the end of their friends. By dawn, faint voices carried through the trees. Rangers had reached the trail after reports that the group had not returned on time. The rescuers moved carefully through the fog, weapons ready, scanning for signs of the animal. They found the wreckage first, ripped bags, shredded fabric, and the remains of the fallen. Not far from the debris, they spotted movement in the ravine. Noah and Liam stumbled out, their faces pale, their bodies marked with bruises and cuts. They were pulled to safety, wrapped in coats, and guided away from the slope. The aftermath left a deep mark on the region. Locals who had long lived with the presence of grizzlies were shaken by the violence. Experts confirmed that the narrow trail and the noise of running feet had triggered the predator's defensive reaction. The bear had been guarding its kill, and the sudden approach of humans on the path had led to the attack. Families of the victims mourned deeply. Mara's dedication to health, Elias's service as a firefighter, and Dorian's passion for training were remembered in memorials held across their communities. The survivors struggled with grief and the memory of being trapped while their closest friends were lost. The forest remained quiet in the days after, the fog still clinging to the cliffs, a place where a routine run had turned into a deadly encounter. June 30th, 2024, began with a thin veil of mist curling across the high slopes of the Caucasus Mountains in Georgia. The jagged ridges and steep valleys had long-drawn mountaineers who sought challenge and beauty in equal measure. That morning, two climbers prepared for a demanding ascent in this rugged land. Sofia Petrov, 34, was a seasoned alpinist from Tbilisi who had dedicated years to climbing the peaks of the Caucasus. Known among her peers for her determination and calm under pressure, she had guided groups on lower trails before deciding to test herself on more dangerous climbs. With her was Luca Bagrationi, 29, from Kutaisi, who carried a deep pride in the Georgian highlands and had grown up exploring mountain paths near his hometown. Together they shared a strong trust, forged from months of training and several successful climbs. The day began with clear skies, but thin clouds soon rolled across the ridges, carrying with them the chill of high altitude. They carried standard climbing equipment, including ropes, packs of food, and ice axes. The climb was not unusual for either of them, though it required stamina and focus. They moved carefully along a steep slope, finding small ledges and cracks in the rock to secure their grip. Hours passed as they pushed upward, the mountain quiet except for the sound of their gear against stone. By afternoon, the pair reached a narrow ledge where they paused to rest. The drop beneath them stretched into fog, while above, the jagged edge of the slope loomed. It was there that danger appeared without warning. From the shadow of a cave above, a brown bear surged forward. The slope gave the animal momentum, and it lunged downward with shocking speed. Luca was the first struck. A massive swipe from the bear's paw slammed him sideways into jagged stone. The impact left him gasping as pain shot through his chest. Blood marked the rock where deep scratches tore across his side. Sofia reacted instantly, raising her ice axe and swinging it in desperation to hold the predator back. The beast's roar filled the highland air, echoing across the valley. The bear turned its fury onto their packs. Claws ripped through ropes and supplies, scattering food and tearing fabric apart. Equipment tumbled down the slope, leaving the climbers with nothing but the tools in their hands. Sofia clung to the rock face, her boots scraping against stone as the bear snapped at her feet, its jaws striking inches away. She pressed herself against the ledge, every muscle locked in fear as the predator clawed at the narrow space between them. The standoff stretched on, the animal refusing to leave while the climbers held their position. The thin air carried every sound. The scrape of claws on stone, the crash of broken gear, and the labored breathing of two mountaineers fighting to survive. The predator kept its place on the slope, its heavy frame looming over the climbers as wind swept through the ridge. Sofia held her ground against the wall of stone, her arms shaking from gripping the axe so tightly. Luca groaned from the impact of his injuries, his body pressed awkwardly against jagged rock where he had fallen. Time seemed to stretch as the minutes dragged on, the echo of the bear's breathing carrying across the highlands. The animal swiped at the ledge again, tearing fragments of fabric from one of the torn packs. Pieces of rope and cloth scattered into the void below, drifting until they vanished in the fog. Its jaws snapped close to Sofia's boots, the sound of teeth grinding against stone ringing in her ears. She tried to stay as still as possible, her back tight against the slope while the animal continued its assault. The bear finally pulled back slightly and tore through what remained of their supplies. Metal pots clattered down the slope, food bags split open, and ropes were shredded beyond use. The climbers could do nothing but watch as their carefully prepared equipment was destroyed in moments. Every strike from the animal seemed to emphasize their helplessness. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the predator retreated. It stepped back toward the cave, its hulking body fading into shadow. The air felt lighter, but neither Sofia nor Luca moved for a long while. The silence was broken only by the wind as the animal vanished into the darkness of its den. Pain spread through Luca's chest as he tried to breathe deeply. Broken ribs and long scratches marked his side. His body weakened from both the fall and the strike. Sophia managed to help him secure himself with the one rope that had not been ripped apart, and together they began the slow descent. Without most of their supplies, rappelling down the slope was far more dangerous. Darkness closed in quickly, making every foothold uncertain. The journey down felt endless. They moved carefully, step by step, guided only by instinct and the faint glow of fading daylight. At times, Luca nearly collapsed, his strength draining with each movement. Sophia supported him, balancing her own fear with the need to keep him alive. Hours passed before they finally reached the lower ridges of the mountain. By then, exhaustion had taken over. Their bodies were scraped, bruised, and frozen from the night air. With no food and little gear, they were forced to press onward toward the nearest settlement. When they stumbled into a village the next day, locals rushed to help them. Luca received treatment for his broken ribs and torn skin, while Sophia was left shaken but alive. The story spread quickly across the highlands. Climbers and shepherds alike were reminded that predators roamed not only the forests, but also the high slopes where few expected them. The encounter showed the thin margin between adventure and survival in the Caucasus Mountains. The mountain remained the same, but for Sophia and Luca, its cliffs would forever carry the memory of the night a bear claimed the heights as its own. June 12, 2023, was a warm day in Big Fork, Montana, a small community surrounded by mountains, rivers, and thick forests, where wildlife often wandered close to human life. Along a rural road just outside town sat a quiet cafe known to travelers and locals as a place to stop for coffee and homemade meals. It was the kind of place where truck drivers, hikers, and families all gathered, finding comfort in simple food and friendly company. That afternoon, the cafe held its usual mix of customers, unaware that a violent disturbance was about to shatter the calm. Among the diners was James Holloway, a 47-year-old trucker from Idaho, who had been driving long hauls for more than 2 decades. His life on the road kept him away from home for days at a time, but he enjoyed the freedom of the open highways. He often stopped at small cafes like this one, taking a break from hours of driving with hot meals and short rests. James was known for his easygoing manner and steady work ethic, qualities that had helped him endure years of demanding routes across the western states. That day, he had parked his rig nearby and stepped inside for lunch before continuing north. The cafe was busy but calm, with children laughing at a corner table, workers sipping coffee before heading back to their jobs, and the staff moving quickly between tables with plates of food. Outside, the forest stretched for miles, and the wildlife that roamed there had always been a part of life in Montana. Yet no one inside expected what would happen next. From the tree line behind the cafe, a massive grizzly caught the scent of bacon grease and food scraps discarded earlier. Hunger drove the animal closer, and soon its weight pressed against the back of the building. Without warning, the rear door splintered inward as the predator forced its way inside. Wood cracked, hinges snapped, and suddenly the dining room filled with chaos. Chairs clattered across the floor as the bear stormed through the narrow space. Coffee mugs tipped and shattered, scattering hot liquid across the tiles. Diners screamed and scrambled away as the animal swiped at tables with one paw, sending plates and silverware flying. In the path of the sudden attack stood James. Before he could move, the massive paw struck him across the shoulder with brutal force, hurling him sideways into a booth. Blood streaked the wall where he hit, and he collapsed beneath the table, stunned and bleeding. The rest of the cafe erupted into panic. A waitress rushed forward, grabbing 2 children and pulling them behind the counter, shielding them from the rampage. The cafe owner ran to the back and grabbed a fire extinguisher, aiming the stream into the air. A cloud of white foam filled the room, the choking spray blinding both people and animal alike. The predator spun wildly in the haze, crashing into walls, overturning a pastry case, and scattering glass across the floor as the chaos grew. The cloud of white powder thickened as the grizzly swung its massive head from side to side. Disoriented by the sudden burst of smoke and noise, it spun in tight circles, striking tables and counters with raw strength. Wood splintered, and glass rained onto the floor as the animal moved through the room in confusion. Frightened diners pressed themselves into corners and beneath booths, trying to stay hidden as the predator tore through the cafe. The air was filled with choking dust and the sharp smell of chemicals from the extinguisher. Visibility shrank to a blur, but the looming shadow of the animal remained clear enough to spread terror. It reared onto its hind legs, towering over the room, before slamming back down onto a display case. The structure shattered into fragments, desserts scattered across the tiles, crushed beneath heavy paws. Plates broke under its steps, and metal chairs screeched as they were flung aside. In the middle of the chaos, James lay under the booth where he had fallen. His shoulder throbbed from deep gashes, blood soaking through his shirt and dripping onto the floor. His breaths came shallow and uneven as he tried to shield himself. The sound of claws raking wood echoed above him, the animal striking at anything in reach. The owner held the extinguisher steady until the canister ran dry. The spray had filled the air with a dense white curtain that stung eyes and made it hard to breathe. The predator staggered, swinging wildly, then lowered its head and pushed toward the broken doorway. With a final crash against the wall, it lumbered back into the open air. The room was left in ruins, furniture overturned and glass littering every surface. For a long moment there was silence. Then movement stirred as the survivors crawled out from their hiding places. The waitress clutched the two children close, both crying but unharmed. Others stood in shock, their clothes covered in dust, their eyes fixed on the torn walls and claw marks gouged deep into the wood. The only sound came from James as he tried to pull himself out from beneath the booth. His body shook with pain, his face pale from blood loss. Emergency calls had already been made during the chaos, and soon the wail of sirens grew louder on the quiet rural road. Paramedics rushed inside, stepping carefully around shattered glass as they reached James. They lifted him gently onto a stretcher, wrapping his wounds to slow the bleeding. Diners watched as he was carried out, their eyes still wide with disbelief at what had unfolded in the middle of a simple afternoon meal. The aftermath left scars on more than just the building. Walls were torn open, windows shattered, and furniture splintered beyond repair. But the greater damage lay in the memory of those who had been inside. News of the midday intrusion spread quickly, shocking even longtime residents accustomed to living near bear country. Experts explained that the scent of grease and scraps had likely lured the animal from the forest, turning an ordinary day into a violent encounter. James survived, but carried the deep wounds and the memory of being struck by the predator. The other patrons left with their own marks, not on skin, but in their minds, recalling every detail of the sudden rampage. The cafe reopened weeks later with stronger doors and stricter waste handling, but for those who had been there, the image of the massive grizzly storming through the room would never fade.